November 22nd, 1963. A date that would forever be seared into the collective memory of an entire generation. If you lived through it, you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news. The classroom where your teacher began to cry. The office where the radio broadcast brought everything to a standstill. The living room where Walter Cronkite removed his glasses and struggled to maintain his composure. This is the story of that day. Not just the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, but the day America changed forever. The day innocence died, and a nation was forced to confront a darkness it hadn't known was possible. The morning of November 22nd began with hope and excitement in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy had arrived the night before as part of a political trip through Texas. The purpose was clear: to mend fences within the Democratic Party and shore up support ahead of the 1964 election. Texas was crucial, and Dallas, despite its reputation as a conservative stronghold, was an important stop. The weather forecast had predicted rain, but Dallas woke to clear, brilliant skies. The bubble top that would normally protect the presidential limousine was left off. Kennedy wanted the people to see him, to connect with him. In retrospect, this decision would haunt the Secret Service for decades. At Love Field Airport, thousands gathered to greet the President and First Lady. Jackie wore a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat, an image that would become tragically iconic by day's end. The crowd was enthusiastic, breaking through barriers to shake hands with the charismatic young president. Kennedy was in his element, grinning broadly, working the rope nine with the ease of a man born to politics. Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie joined the Kennedys in the presidential limousine, a modified 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible. The motorcade route through Dallas had been published in the newspapers days before. Thousands lined the streets, some taking long lunch breaks from work, others pulling children out of school for a chance to see the President of the United States. As the motorcade wound through downtown Dallas, the reception was warmer than anyone had expected. People waved American flags, held up signs, and cheered. Just minutes before reaching Dealey Plaza, Nellie Connally turned to Kennedy and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy replied, "That is very obvious." The presidential motorcade turned from Main Street onto Houston Street at 12:29 p.m. Central Time. The crowds were still thick here, still cheering. At the corner of Houston and Elm, the limousine made a sharp 120-degree turn, slowing to approximately 11 miles per hour as it descended the slight grade of Elm Street. To the right stood the Texas Book Depository, a 7-story warehouse building. Employees watched from the windows, eating their lunches, hoping for a glimpse of the president. On the 6th floor, in the southeast corner window, the view was unobstructed. At 12:30 p.m. Central Time, the first shot rang out. Many witnesses would later say they thought it was a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. The president's hands moved toward his throat. Governor Connally, sitting directly in front of Kennedy, turned to look back, concerned by the president's reaction. Then came the second shot. This bullet struck Governor Connally in the back, passing through his chest, shattering his wrist, and lodging in his thigh. He collapsed into his wife's lap, crying out, "My God, they're going to kill us all!" For a brief, terrible moment, less than 5 seconds, but in eternity to those in the car, there was confusion. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, sitting in the front passenger seat, radioed, "We are hit." Jackie Kennedy, sitting to the president's left, turned toward her husband. His hands were at his throat. She would later describe seeing a puzzled expression on his face. Then came the third shot. The impact was catastrophic. The bullet struck the right rear of Kennedy's skull, causing massive trauma. The president was thrown violently backward and to the left. Jackie Kennedy screamed, "They've killed my husband!" In her shock and desperation, she began climbing onto the trunk of the moving limousine, later explaining she was trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, riding on the follow-up car, made a desperate dash to reach the presidential limousine. He leapt onto the back bumper, pushing Mrs. Kennedy back into the car and shielding the president and first lady with his own body. He looked down and saw the catastrophic wound. He knew immediately that the president could not survive. Driver William Greer accelerated, racing toward Parkland Memorial Hospital 4 miles away. The journey took approximately 4 minutes. In the back seat, Jackie Kennedy cradled her husband's shattered head in her lap, repeating over and over, "Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack." Behind them, Dealey Plaza erupted into chaos. People screamed, dropped to the ground, ran for cover. Some thought the shots came from the grassy knoll to the right of the motorcade. Others were certain they came from the book depository. Parents grabbed their children. A woman fainted. Abraham Zapruder, standing on a concrete pedestal with his 8mm Bell & Howell camera, had captured the entire assassination on film, footage that would become the most analyzed 26 seconds in history. Within minutes, Dallas police officer Marion Baker entered the Texas Book Depository, racing up the stairs. On the second floor, he encountered a calm, composed man in the lunchroom. Building Superintendent Roy Truly identified him as an employee, Lee Oswald Oswald. Baker let him go. 3 minutes later, Oswald would leave the building and disappear into the streets of Dallas. The presidential limousine screeched to a halt at Parkland Memorial Hospital's emergency entrance at 12:36 p.m. Central Time. Doctors and nurses who had been alerted minutes earlier rushed out with a gurney, but Jackie Kennedy refused to let go of her husband. Agent Hill gently urged her, "Please, Mrs. Kennedy, we need to get the president to the doctors." Still, she clung to him. Finally, she whispered, "They've shot his head off," and reluctantly released him. As hospital staff wheeled the president into Trauma Room 1, the full extent of his injuries became immediately apparent to the medical team. Dr. Malcolm Parry, the attending physician, later testified that the wound was obviously mortal. Yet for the next 25 minutes, doctors fought desperately to save the president's life. They performed a tracheotomy. They administered oxygen, blood transfusions, and stimulants. They performed closed-chest cardiac massage. Nothing worked. President Kennedy had lost too much blood, and the damage to his brain was too severe. At 1 p.m. Central Time, Dr. Kemp Clark pronounced John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, dead. He was 46 years old. In a small room adjacent to Trauma Room 1, Jackie Kennedy waited. She had refused to change out of her blood-stained pink suit. When told her husband was gone, she insisted on seeing him one final time. She held his hand, kissed his fingers, his cheek, his lips. A priest administered the last rites of the Catholic Church. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who had been 3 cars behind in the motorcade, was rushed to Parkland Hospital and then to Love Field Airport. The priority now was protecting the continuity of government. No one knew if this was a broader conspiracy, if more attacks were coming, if the vice president himself was a target. Meanwhile, in Trauma Room 2, doctors were treating Governor Connolly, who had sustained serious injuries but would survive. The governor's wife never left his side, her clothes also stained with blood, her husband's and the president's. As word spread through Parkland Hospital, nurses wept openly. Doctors stood in hallways, stunned. Outside, the crowd grew larger, reporters arriving in droves, police struggling to maintain order. Rumors spread wildly. The president was still alive. The vice president had been shot. There were multiple assassins. The Soviets were involved. At 1:26 p.m. Birmingham time, before the official announcement had been made to the public, Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant White House press secretary, approached 2 priests who had just administered last rites. "He's gone?" Kilduff asked. The priests nodded. It would be another 7 minutes before the world would know for certain. At 1:33 p.m. Eastern Time, CBS News interrupted the soap opera As the World Turns with a bulletin. Walter Cronkite appeared on screen, visibly shaken, but maintaining his professional composure. From Dallas, Texas, The Flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Cronkite removed his glasses, glanced at the clock on the wall, and struggled for a moment to maintain his composure before continuing. Across America, time stopped. In schools, principals made announcements over intercoms. Teachers broke down crying in front of their students. In New York City, a teacher at PS 166 in Manhattan collapsed. Students were sent home early, walking through streets filled with weeping adults. In offices and factories, work ceased. People gathered around televisions and radios, desperate for information, hoping against hope that the initial reports were wrong. Strangers embraced on street corners. In Times Square, the news ticker displayed the tragic message, and crowds stood silently, staring up in disbelief. Department stores closed. Broadway theaters canceled performances. Professional football commissioner Pete Rozelle made the controversial decision to play the NFL's Sunday games as scheduled, a decision he would later call the biggest regret of his career. The stock market, which had been open when the news broke, saw immediate chaos. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted, losing $11 billion in value in the first hour. Trading was suspended early. In the Soviet Union, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis with Kennedy just a year earlier, wept openly upon hearing the news. Around the world, leaders and citizens alike mourned. In Britain, Parliament adjourned. In France, President Charles de Gaulle declared, "President Kennedy died like a soldier, under fire." Even in nations that had opposed Kennedy's policies, the shock was palpable. Churches and synagogues across America opened their doors. People flooded in, seeking comfort, seeking answers, seeking some way to process the incomprehensible. How could this happen? How could the President of the United States be murdered in daylight broad day in an American city? Radio and television networks abandoned all regular programming. For the next 4 days, Americans would be glued to their screens, watching history unfold in real time in a way that had never happened before. This was the first time television served as the primary news source for a national tragedy, and the continuous coverage created a shared experience of grief unlike anything the nation had experienced before. In Dallas, police frantically searched for suspects. Initial reports were confused and contradictory. Some witnesses insisted the shots came from the grassy knoll. Others pointed to the book depository. Dallas police began sealing off the area, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence. At 1:45 p.m. in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, police officer J.D. Tippett spotted a man matching the description broadcast over police radio. He pulled his patrol car alongside the man and stopped to question him. The man approached the car, pulled out a revolver, and shot Officer Tippett 4 times, killing him. Witnesses saw the shooter flee, tossing empty shell casings into nearby bushes. At approximately 1:50 p.m., the suspect entered the Texas Theater on Jefferson Boulevard without buying a ticket. The theater's cashier, suspicious of his behavior, called the police. Within minutes, the theater was surrounded. At 1:51 p.m., house lights came up. Police officers entered, moving cautiously down the aisles. In the back of the theater sat Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old employee of the Texas Book Depository. When police approached, he pulled his revolver and attempted to fire, but an officer grabbed the gun. A brief scuffle ensued before Oswald was subdued and handcuffed. As officers led him out of the theater, he shouted, "I am not resisting arrest! I am not resisting arrest!" and "I protest this police brutality." At 2 p.m., Oswald was in custody at Dallas Police Headquarters, facing questions about the murder of Officer Tippit. By evening, he would be charged with the assassination of President Kennedy. At Love Field, Air Force One sat on the tarmac, engines running. Vice President Johnson was aboard, but the plane couldn't leave, not yet. President Kennedy's body was still at Parkland Hospital, and federal law required an autopsy before the body could be removed from Texas. But federal authorities, Secret Service agents, and Kennedy's staff insisted the president's body return to Washington immediately. A tense standoff ensued. Dallas County Medical Examiner Dr. Earl Rose physically blocked the doorway, insisting no body could leave without an autopsy. Kennedy aides, Secret Service agents, and a local justice of peace engaged in a heated confrontation. Finally, Kennedy's staff simply pushed past Dr. Rose, loaded the casket into an ambulance, and rushed to Love Field. Texas officials were outraged, but no one was willing to engage in a physical altercation over the president's body. At 2:08 p.m. Central Time, the bronze casket containing President Kennedy's body was loaded onto Air Force One through the rear door. Jackie Kennedy, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit, boarded with the casket. She had been urged repeatedly to change clothes, but she refused. She said, "I want them to see what they have done." Vice President Johnson, on the advice of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, decided to take the oath of office in Dallas before departing. The nation needed a president, and the sooner the transition occurred, the clearer the line of authority would be. Johnson's personal secretary located a federal judge to administer the oath, Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who rushed to Love Field. At 2:38 p.m., in the cramped cabin of Air Force One, surrounded by 27 witnesses, Lyndon Baines Johnson placed his left hand on President Kennedy's personal Catholic missal and raised his right hand. Jackie Kennedy stood to his left, still wearing the blood-stained suit, her face a mask of shock and grief. Lady Bird Johnson stood to his right. Judge Hughes administered the oath. "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God." Johnson became the 36th President of the United States. The entire ceremony lasted just 28 seconds. Photographer Cecil Stoughton captured the moment, creating one of the most famous photographs in American history. The new president being sworn in, the widowed First Lady standing beside him, her husband's blood still visible on her clothes. At 2:47 p.m., Air Force One took off from Dallas, carrying President Johnson, the widowed Mrs. Kennedy, and the body of the fallen president. During the flight, Johnson began making calls, consulting with advisors, preparing to assume the full responsibilities of the presidency. Jackie Kennedy remained in the rear of the plane, sitting beside her husband's casket, holding the hand of his slain husband's trusted aide, Ken O'Donnell. The flight took 2 hours and 32 minutes. As Air Force One approached Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, television cameras waited.
The nation watched as the rear door opened and Jackie Kennedy emerged, followed by Robert Kennedy, who had rushed to the airbase to meet his brother's body. The bronze casket was lowered carefully from the plane into a waiting Navy ambulance. President Johnson briefly addressed the nation from the tarmac. "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." In Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald sat in an interrogation room, maintaining a defiant posture. "I didn't shoot anybody," he insisted. "I'm just a patsy." But evidence was mounting. In the Texas Book Depository, investigators found a Mannlicher Carcano rifle on the 6th floor, hidden behind boxes near the southeast window. 3 spent shell casings lay on the floor beneath the window. Fingerprints on the rifle and boxes would later be matched to Oswald. Oswald's life story began to emerge, and it was strange and troubling. Born in New Orleans in 1939, he had joined the Marine Corps as a teenager, where he qualified as a sharpshooter, but he became increasingly disillusioned with American society, reading communist literature and teaching himself Russian. In 1959, at age 20, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, renouncing his U.S. citizenship and attempting to become a Soviet citizen. He lived in Minsk, worked in a factory, married a Russian woman named Marina, and had 2 daughters. But Soviet life disappointed him as well. In 1962, he returned to the United States with his family. Back in America, Oswald drifted. He lived in Fort Worth, then New Orleans, where he created a one-man chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro organization. He distributed pro-Castro leaflets on the streets, got into altercations with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and appeared on local radio and television defending the Cuban Revolution. In April 1963, according to evidence that would later emerge, Oswald attempted to assassinate retired U.S. Army General Edwin Walker, a prominent right-wing figure, firing a shot through Walker's window. The bullet missed, and the crime went unsolved until after Kennedy's assassination. In September 1963, Oswald traveled to Mexico City, visiting the Cuban and Soviet embassies, allegedly seeking a visa to travel to Cuba. Both embassies rejected his requests. Frustrated and increasingly unstable, he returned to Dallas in October and took a job at the Texas School Book Depository, a position arranged through a friend of his wife. As Dallas police interrogated Oswald through the evening of November 22nd and into November 23rd, he remained defiant, sarcastic, and uncooperative. "I want a lawyer," he demanded. "I know my rights." But he never formally requested a specific attorney, and none was provided during his interrogations. News reporters crowded Dallas Police headquarters, creating a circus-like atmosphere. In a decision that would be heavily criticized, Dallas Police allowed reporters unprecedented access. Oswald was paraded through hallways crowded with journalists and cameras, shouting, "I'm a patsy," and "Everybody will know who I am now." The interrogations continued through Saturday, November 23rd. Oswald denied everything. He denied owning a rifle. He denied shooting the president. He denied shooting Officer Tippit. But the evidence continued to accumulate. Witnesses placed him in the 6th floor window. Ballistics would eventually match bullets to his rifle. His palm print was found on the weapon. Throughout Saturday, November 23rd, America remained in shock. Television networks continued wall-to-wall coverage. The nation watched as President Kennedy's flag-draped casket was carried into the White House and placed in the East Room, where an honor guard stood watch. Jackie Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the Kennedy family received a steady stream of dignitaries paying their respects. World leaders began arriving in Washington for the funeral. Former Presidents Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower came to offer condolences. The line of mourners seemed endless. In Dallas, arrangements were made to transfer Oswald from the city jail to the county jail, a more secure facility. The transfer was scheduled for Sunday morning, November 24th. Against the advice of security experts, Dallas police announced the exact time of the transfer, 10 a.m. Television networks prepared to broadcast it live. Churches across America held memorial services. Pastors struggled to find words adequate to the moment. In homes everywhere, families gathered around television sets, unable to look away, united in grief. Sales of newspapers broke records. People wanted to understand, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? The question everyone asked was, where were you when you heard? It became a defining moment for an entire generation. People remembered exact details, what they were wearing, who they were with, the temperature of the room, with crystal clarity decades later. The assassination became a before and after moment in American history. Saturday evening, the Kennedy family decided that President Kennedy would lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda on Sunday, giving the American people a chance to pay their respects. The funeral would be held Monday, November 25th. As night fell on Saturday, a sense of unreality persisted. How could this have happened? In America, in 1963, the president, young and vital, full of promise and potential, murdered in broad daylight. It seemed impossible, like a bad dream from which the nation couldn't wake. Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963. At Dallas Police Headquarters, preparations were underway to transfer Lee Harvey Oswald to the county jail. Reporters and camera crews crowded into the basement garage, jockeying for position. Television networks broadcast live. Shortly after 11 a.m., Oswald emerged from an elevator, handcuffed to Detective Jim Lavelle, who famously wore a light-colored suit. As cameras rolled and flashbulbs popped, Oswald walked through the crowded basement. Suddenly, a man lunged from the crowd. A gunshot rang out. Oswald crumpled, clutching his abdomen, crying out in pain. The man with the gun was immediately tackled by police officers and buried under a pile of bodies. "He's been shot," someone screamed. "Lee Oswald has been shot." Millions of Americans watched it happen live on television, the first murder ever broadcast in real time on national TV. The chaos in the basement was immediate and total. Reporters scattered. Police shouted conflicting orders. Oswald was rushed back upstairs to the same emergency room at Parkland Hospital where President Kennedy had been pronounced dead just 48 hours earlier. The shooter was identified as Jack Ruby, a 52-year-old Dallas nightclub owner. Police knew him. He often hung around headquarters, bringing coffee and donuts. He had been in the crowd during Oswald's media appearances on Friday and Saturday. Now he had done the unthinkable. He had murdered the alleged assassin on live TV. At Parkland Hospital, doctors fought to save Oswald's life, but the damage was too severe. At 1:07 p.m. Central Time, Lee Harvey Oswald was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. He never stood trial for killing President Kennedy. He never gave a full confession. He never explained his motives. He took his secrets to the grave. Ruby was arrested and charged with murder. During questioning, he claimed he shot Oswald to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of having to testify at a trial. He said, "I wanted to show that a Jew had guts." But questions immediately arose. Was Ruby part of a conspiracy? Had he been sent to silence Oswald? Was the assassination bigger than one troubled young man? Ruby was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but the verdict was overturned on appeal. Before a new trial could begin, Ruby died of cancer in 1967, insisting until the end that he acted alone, impulsively, driven by grief and anger over Kennedy's death. Monday, November 25, 1963. John F. Kennedy's funeral brought the nation to a standstill. Over 250,000 people had filed past his coffin in the Capitol Rotunda through Sunday night and into Monday morning. The funeral procession moved from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral. Jackie Kennedy, dressed in black and wearing a veil, walked the entire route on foot, flanked by Robert Kennedy and Edward Kennedy. Behind them walked the world's leaders, Charles de Gaulle of France, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Prince Philip of Britain, and representatives from over 90 countries. The riderless horse named Blackjack, with boots reversed in the stirrups, an ancient military tradition honoring a fallen leader, followed the caisson carrying the president's casket. The clip-clap of hooves on pavement was the only sound as the procession passed. At St. Matthew's Cathedral, John F. Kennedy, Jr., who had turned 3 years old that very day, stood with his mother and sister Caroline on the cathedral steps as his father's casket emerged. Jackie Kennedy bent down and whispered something to her son. The little boy stepped forward and saluted his father's casket, an image that would break hearts for generations to come. The president was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 50 fighter jets, one for each state, flew overhead in formation. Air Force One dipped its wings in a final salute. An eternal flame was lit at the gravesite, where it burns to this day. The assassination of John F. Kennedy marked the end of an era. The optimism and innocence of the early 1960s, the promise of Camelot, died in Dealey Plaza. The nation would never quite be the same. Trust in government would never fully recover. Conspiracy theories would proliferate for decades. For those who lived through it, November 22, 1963, remains the day that changed everything. The day the music died. The day America lost its innocence. The day everyone remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news. If you were there, you remember, and you'll never forget. Where were you?